How do I know this fact is true?
He says, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting.
9 appearances of the risen Jesus in those 4 Gospels. So that's 7 ancient sources.
Paul was one of the Pharisees who had Jesus crucified.
Right. The evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming. What I found fascinating in studying this as a skeptic is that when you study ancient history, and you're looking at some fact about the life of Alexander the Great, for instance, and you dig down, how do I know this fact is true? Most of the time, it's based on one source, maybe 2 sources of information. But for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Jesus. I can tick them off real quick so you know what they are. The first is that creed I mentioned earlier, a creed whose historical credentials are so strong that one of the few Jewish New Testament scholars, Pinchas Lapid, said it may be taken as a statement of eyewitnesses. Second, we have Paul's testimony, because Paul said, I encountered the risen Christ, and then he got to know the disciples.
Which was just what people around the world are encountering today on the Damascus. And Paul was one of the Pharisees who had Jesus crucified.
Right. Exactly.
So he was the enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the Taliban now,
no
coming over to our side kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right.
And it says on the Damascus road, he's going to arrest and kill Christians. He was there when Stephen was martyred, giving him 2 thumbs up, because Stephen believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And he's like, that's wrong. We're getting rid of these people. When on the Damascus road, this brilliant God of light appears to him. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
All over the world today. This is near-death experiences.
Yeah.
Who are you, Lord? He asked. And he says, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. And Jesus didn't tell him the gospel. He didn't tell him what to do. He said, you'll be told. And then later sends Ananias to explain to him. And Paul still had a choice, because he had a lot to lose.
Yeah.
Is he going to leave behind his power and his prestige and then suffer? Because he did.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's huge,
absolutely huge, and no incentive to do that. But what's also interesting is after he became the Apostle Paul, he became friends with many of the disciples, the other eyewitnesses. So he knew Peter, James, and John. Right. And he says in 1 Corinthians, in his letter he wrote, he said, whether it is I or they, this is what we preach. So he's saying, look, I encountered the risen Christ. So have they. So he's confirming that the disciples were eyewitnesses. He's another point of confirmation. The third area of evidence, corroboration, is the book of Acts. Even skeptical scholars will accept that the book of Acts is the account of the spread of the early church. And what is the thing that drove it? It was a proclamation of the resurrection. So here we have Peter in Acts chapter 2, who gets up before a crowd, and he says, men of Israel, listen to these words. This Jesus, a man attested to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which he did in your midst. You know that he did. He's appealing to their common knowledge. And then he says, this Jesus God raised from the dead, to which we're all witnesses. And how did they react? History tells us that 3,000 people said, Peter, we know you're telling us the truth. What do we do? They repented, and the church was born. So that's the first 3 sources. Then we have the next 4 sources, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are historical biographies based on eyewitness accounts. There's 9 appearances of the risen Jesus in those 4 Gospels. So that's 7 ancient sources. But then...
Plus you got Luke, who interviewed Mary.
Oh, yeah, there's other sources,
others, yeah.
Right. But we have sources from people who sat under the teachings of the eyewitnesses. So, for instance, if you still were teaching at your church in Austin, Shawn, if you were to come to his church for 3 years, you'd have a pretty good idea what he believes, right? Yeah. Well, we have writings by people who sat under the teachings of the apostles themselves and can report what they said about the resurrection. So we have a letter that was written by Clement. Clement was, we believe, ordained by Peter himself. And Clement writes a letter in the 1st century to the church in Corinth, and he says that the disciples had complete confidence. Why? Why did they have so much confidence? Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, because they were eyewitnesses to the risen Lord. And then Polycarp, who was appointed by John himself to be bishop at Smyrna, he writes a letter to the Philippian church, and he mentions the resurrection 5 times in that letter. And he said, talking about Paul and the other apostles, he said, "For they did not love the present age, but him who died for them and was raised by God on the 3rd day." So he's confirming the teachings of these eyewitnesses that they encountered the risen Christ. That's 9 very early eyewitness-based accounts of the corroboration of the eyewitnesses, the disciples who encountered personally the risen Jesus. That is an avalanche of historical data.
Can you tell he's a lawyer?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I just have a law degree.
Well, no, but here's the significance is what Lee's saying, and he was the legal editor for the Chicago Tribune, so not a slouch. But also Simon Greenleaf, who was a lawyer who wrote the Treatise of Legal Evidence, right?
He's the guy who made Harvard Law School what it is today, the 2nd best law school, because I went to Yale. So,
well, there you have it. I went to the University of Texas.
Good basketball team.
Okay. So Simon Greenleaf was always making fun of Christians and Christianity in his legal classes until some of his students came up and challenged him to take his treatise, his works on legal evidence, how to evaluate legal evidence, and put it against all the documents and evidence that Lee just said. He came to faith just like Lee.
I remember
when he looked at the evidence.
That's right.
Same with C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, when I was an atheist, I went and I'm doing this investigation into the resurrection. I remember going to the library, and of course, they didn't have Simon Greenleaf's book, which was written in the 1800s. And so I put an interlibrary loan, and it took about 6 months. And 6 months later, they give me this copy from the 1800s of this book by Simon Greenleaf, this great legal scholar who reports on the resurrection and so forth. And it was held together by rubber bands. But back then, we didn't have the internet. But, that's another great example is Sir Lionel Luckhoo, who was the greatest defense attorney in the world, according to the Guinness Book of World Records.
And more convictions of murder trials.
245 convictions in a row that he won acquittals 245 times in a row, either before the jury or on appeal. Knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth, became a member of the Supreme Court of his country, and he was a doubter about the resurrection. Same thing. He was challenged to investigate it. He did, and I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that summarized his conclusion. He said, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt." This from the greatest defense attorney who ever lived. Wow. And here's the funny thing. I told that story at Saddleback Church in Southern California, where Leslie and I had moved in the year 2000 to be a pastor there. And a woman came up to me afterwards, and she said, "Hey, I'm your new neighbor. You're moving into my neighborhood. We haven't met yet." I said, "Oh, great to meet you." Said, "Yeah." Said, "I'm Sir Lionel Luckhoo's sister."
No way.
What's his sister? And she not only confirmed the story, she showed me his private documents that he had done his research on.
Oh, how
cool. Yeah.
But here's the point, and this is what got me into this. This is why I left my career in engineering. I was like, there's so much evidence. Why has no one told me this?
Yeah.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.